So, good morning everybody. As Minnie said, I'm Alexandra Pickard and I work in NHS England's Genomics unit, and this is a new unit that has been recently set up to support the implementation of NHS England's genomic programme. I firstly have to give an apology as Professor Sue Hill was going to give this talk. However, as I'll explain shortly, we've just, the bids for the procurement for the genomic laboratory hubs closed on Monday. So I'm afraid the rest of the team is in lockdown and they're not coming out until they've read them. So I'm here today to give this talk. So before I give you the detail in terms of what we're doing on the genomics infrastructure and how we're building that for the future, I thought I'd give a bit of detail about the context and what we're working from. So we're not starting from scratch, from nothing. As many of you will probably be aware, genetic testing has been used in the NHS for some decades, and so all we're doing is building on that. So when we say we're introducing genomic medicine into the NHS, that isn't technically true because it's already been happening. What we're doing is kind of embedding it further into a clinical service. And this has been built upon by a number of investments from the government, and strategies setting out the strategic direction, as Ed's just mentioned, Generation Genome and the 100,000 Genomes Project, really building on what we know about genomic medicine and how we can implement it in the future, and really the industrial strategy and how we can now implement that in the future. And what we're trying to do is enable quicker diagnosis and ending the diagnostic odyssey that for many patients goes over months and years, making sure that we can match people to the most effective medications and interventions, and increasing people surviving cancer through more accurate diagnosis and precision therapy. And I think this slide really demonstrates what personalisation is in practice, so how we're using genomic medicine to lay the foundations for personalised medicine in the future, to really drive early diagnosis and a greater diagnostic yield, have that more precise diagnosis that we can then use for more effective and precision treatments, and fewer adverse drug reactions, but also opening up other opportunities in terms of understanding eligibility for clinical trials, so whether certain genetic markers mean that you're more eligible and things that we didn't know about clinical trials, and then also looking at preventative approaches and how we can use genomics in terms of prognostics. But this is an iterative cycle, this is an iterative process, and as we learn more about genomics, we'll drive this cycle round to be able to diagnose earlier, to be able to have more precise diagnosis. So this isn't something that's going to happen overnight, and this is something that we're going to have to use the data and what we learn from people's genome to drive this forward. And so key to this is making sure that the patients are at the heart of everything we do, and that patients have trust in the system that we're building and what we're how we're using data and how we're using their information so that they can see the benefits and the wider patient population can see the benefits. We also know that from our existing infrastructure and from things like the 100,000 Genomes Project that there are some challenges in our current infrastructure, and for example things around inequity and access to testing. We know that there's currently some variation across the country, so the testing that you get in Cornwall may not be the same as the testing you get in Newcastle. And there's a variability in quality and outcomes. We know there are issues around data collection and standardisation of data and sharing of data, and that there's a limited integration between some of the laboratories. This has led to some inefficiencies in the provision of genetic testing and the use of expertise. Now we're trying to build on all of this. Some of these challenges have only been uncovered because of the excellent contribution that the genetic laboratories and the clinical genetic services and the molecular pathology laboratories have made to projects like the 100,000 Genomes Project and to the NHS Clinical Service. So what we want to do is evolve these services for the future. So what we're trying to do in NHS England is develop our genomic medicine service, and it really has 4 key aims. And the first key aim is how we can provide a consistent and equitable care across England. So it should not matter where you live, you should be able to get access to the same genomic testing across the country. And that testing should be operating to a common set of standards and should be of high quality. The testing will then be delivered through a directory or a list of tests that for the first time has been pulled together initially for cancer and rare and inherited disease, but it will list all of the technologies from single gene through to whole genome sequencing and be really clear about what testing can be accessed across England. And what we really want to do is be able to build this service to have a national database that will support and inform academic and industry research and discovery and clinical trial recruitment through having a broader service where we can access the data. So part of the genomic medicine service is going to be bringing together our existing infrastructure. So as I was saying before, the laboratories with the clinical genetic services, with the NHS Genomic Medicine Centres that were developed as part of the project, to deliver an integrated service that has an integrated delivery model. So really building on those relationships that have already been developed, but integrating them further. And this will be driven by having a high quality service, by being underpinned by an informatics system that can support the data elements of the system, and also workforce development. So making sure that as we embed genomic medicine into the NHS and into routine care, that we have the expertise required in order to deliver that service, and we spread the expertise from our excellent clinical genetic services into the clinicians who need to be able to understand how they interpret some of this genomic information, or to ensure that clinicians are supported where they've got rare variants or information that needs more expertise, where they can get that expertise from and how they can be supported with this implementation. And all of this is part of delivering the best value for patients, but also for taxpayers. As Ed mentioned in his talk, a number of patients receive multiple genomic tests that we can now pull up into having either a single panel or whole genome sequence, so that we're getting the best benefit for patients, but also the best value for taxpayers. And that's really driving the medicines optimisation and the personalisation of interventions. So Ed slightly stole my thunder with this slide. It may look familiar, but these are the building blocks for the genomic medicine service. And so you can see at the top the three key elements of the genomic medicine centres and the clinical genetic services, the laboratory networks, and also the National Genomic Test Directory, which I'll go into more detail on in a second. And then Genomics England, we're supported by Genomics England and working in partnership with them to develop the informatics infrastructure that will underpin the genomic medicine service and the knowledge base and data store. They'll also be supporting the provision of the whole genome sequencing. So we're going to have a national provider of whole genome sequencing. What we don't want is all the different areas of the country having to buy their own machines and having variation in whole genome sequencing across the country. So we want a national provision for that. And also the clinical interpretation pipeline. Genomics England will be supporting that area as well. And we're working very closely with them on those elements. Key to this is going to be workforce development. So we're working very closely with Health Education England and their genomic education programme, and ensuring that we're upskilling existing staff and make sure that we've got ongoing professional engagement to make sure that clinicians can access all the excellent materials through the Health Education England programme, for example, the Masters in Genomics. And also driving the industry and academic partnerships and international partnerships as well, has been mentioned before, and making sure that we can support the ongoing research and development through clinical care. The timeline that we're working to is ambitious. So the procurement for the genomic laboratory hubs is currently live. So the bids came in on Monday, and these will be evaluated over the coming weeks. And we will then have a process of mobilisation, and the labs will be in operation from October this year. I think it's fair to say that we are on a journey with this, and that in October we're not going to flick a switch and everything's going to be everything's going to be sorted. We are going to be going through a period of transition, and we're going to be working very closely with the hubs, with the clinical genetic services, with the genomic medicine centres to evolve this and to really reach our vision. But it's not going to happen overnight. But what will happen from the 1st of October is that whole genome sequencing will be available in the NHS as part of routine clinical care, and that's the real shift, and that we'll have a national network of genomic laboratory hubs to work with. So a key area of interest for this group will potentially be the National Genomic Test Directory. So this is going to be our list of tests, initially for cancer and rare disease, that will be commissioned by the NHS in England, and it will ensure that there's equity of access for patients, so it will be very clear as to what tests patients will be able to access across England to tackle the unmet needs and the variation. So we know there's variation across the country, we know there are issues around access to some genomic testing, and we want to standardise the testing approach so that all patients get the best standard of care. So we want to make sure that it doesn't matter where you are in the country, for a clinical condition, you will have access to a test which offers you the best standard of care. But also, really importantly in this field, being able to keep up to date with the most appropriate technology. It seems that technology moves incredibly fast in this area, so we need to make sure that we put in place a process that enables us to keep up to date with that technology, so we're getting the best diagnostic and clinical outcomes. So the directory will specify what testing is available, the technology platform by which the testing is delivered, and by this I don't mean which company or which technology you use. What we mean is the fact that it may be delivered as a single gene, as a small panel, as a large panel, as whole genome sequencing. So the test directory is technology agnostic in terms of actually what technology is used, but it indicates at what level of aggregation the testing should be carried out. And what we really want to do is being able to drive the best value from the testing across a clinical indication and stop series of single gene tests being carried out. It'll also include the clinical requirements for accessing a test, so to support clinicians to understand which patients should or should not be having a test. And this will align with NICE guidance and other clinical guidance that's already available. And importantly, the test directory will include the commissioner who is responsible for the test. So we understand in the system at the moment there's a great deal of confusion about which tests are paid for by whom. So for the first time it will actually clarify who is responsible for paying for that test. So the directory will be published for 2018-19 from October, and it will be delivered as part of a national testing service through the new genomic laboratory hubs that will be working as part of a national network. It will replace the NHS directory that our colleagues at UKGTN have built, and it's a really good basis on which for us to start to develop the test directory going forward. So, as I was just saying, the test directory very much builds on the work of UKGTN. This initial test directory is really pulling together what we currently already know. So for rare disease, that was brilliant. We've got UKGTN. That's great work that's already been done. And for cancer, it was slightly more difficult because there was no one list of cancer genomic tests. So for the first time, we will have a list of the testing for cancer and rare disease that will be available in the NHS in England. We set up 2 working groups supported by Genomics England, a cancer and a rare disease transition working group to support the development of the content of the first directory. And initially it covers 350 rare disease clinical indications and 196 cancer clinical indications. And we're very aware that this is an iterative process, this is going to evolve over time, and we expect the testing repertoire to change as we get new evidence, as new technologies emerge. I think I've mentioned many of the areas of the content of the test directory already, so the clinical indication, the scope, the genes and the targets that will be included. But the other thing is that the test will be assigned as either core or specialist. So the core tests will be delivered by each of the genomic laboratory hubs. And these are your real high throughput, high volume tests that can be delivered on those high throughput platforms. And then your specialist tests will be those ones that either have lower volumes or require additional expertise to support the interpretation. So they'll be delivered by between 2 or 4 of the genomic laboratory hubs, but it will be very clear for all 7 as to where their samples should be going. So who will be responsible for delivering some of those specialist tests. And for example, there's specialist tests for cardiology, neurology, endocrinology. So all of that is part of the procurement that's currently going on, and so we'll know quite shortly, hopefully, fingers crossed, where those tests will be being performed. So as I've mentioned, it's going to be really important for us to be able to iterate and continue to review the testing that's available on the NHS in England, and so the test directory will be updated annually. And it's important that this update is evidence-based and the process is robust and it can keep up with the pace of change. So we're currently working through this. This is not a final document, and that's part of the reason I'm here today, is to see what additional work we need to do in this area. But our proposal is that we'll have an expert panel that will support the review of the genomic testing evidence in cancer and rare disease, and they will have the scientific and clinical expertise required to do that. There'll be arrangements for calling for evidence, and this will very much be built on the UKGTM process with required amendments in order to keep up with the changing pace of technology and how we see that moving in the future. And we're also working with our colleagues in the devolved nations to make sure that this is a UK-wide approach and not something that we're just driving forward in England. We want to make sure that we're continuing to align across the UK in terms of how we evaluate technologies. So the process really has 3 aims, and these very much align with the aims of the overall service. So it's to systematically review all of the genomic testing available by condition. So at the minute we through UKGTN, tests were evaluated on more of a test-by-test basis, and that has started to evolve over time. But what we will be doing moving forward is evaluating the genomic tests across a condition so that we're having a definitive repertoire of testing, and to make sure that we're getting the best value for each of those clinical conditions out of the testing. We're looking to also standardise the testing available, so we'll be really defining what genes need to be tested and by which platform technology they should be delivered. So this is making sure that patients are getting access to an equitable standard of testing across the country. But we also want to make sure that we get access to the most effective and affordable technologies now and in the future. So we're not looking to evaluate something that in 6 months to a year down the line is not going to be the most up-to-date technology or the most effective technology. So that's there's some quite hard, difficult aims for us to be able to achieve, but that's what we're looking to do. And so the process potentially could have 2 key parts. So a clinical assessment, so an assessment of the effectiveness of the test and the clinical evidence that supports that test. So I think Jane, my colleague who's just joined us from UKGTN, has nicely put it, does the test do what it says on the tin? Does it clinically do what is necessary? And then looking at an operational assessment, so what will implementing that test look like in terms of the infrastructure and the resource required, or in terms of what it might look like against what's coming up on the horizon. And the committee will support this review and how this review takes place. But this will bring together for the first time not only the evaluation side, but the commissioning side from NHS England. So what we'll do on a UK level is make sure that we're assessing the evidence together, but then from an England perspective, NHS England will be very clearly defining which tests will be commissioned in England, and then our partners in the devolved nations will go through their own governance processes to do that. But what we're hoping is that it will really clarify the landscape in terms of what tests will be commissioned. So I think today is a real huge opportunity to learn about what we at NHS England need to be doing in order to make sure that any of our evaluation processes and our processes we're putting in place in the future are really underpinned by what's going on in the regulatory landscape more broadly. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the interesting talks and discussions later today. Thank you.